Why powerful regimes collapse faster than weak ones. Ladies and gentlemen, today's discussion is not simply about political power. It is about something far more dangerous. Why does power often collapse faster the moment it becomes absolute? History shows us a strange paradox. The stronger a regime appears from the outside, the more fragile it often becomes on the inside. And the reason is psychological. Because authoritarian power does not collapse the way most people imagine. It is rarely destroyed first by foreign enemies, military invasions, or public protests. It begins with something much smaller. Suspicion. The moment a ruler stops fearing outsiders and starts fearing the people closest to him, the system has already entered the first stage of self-destruction. This is where the psychology of dictatorship becomes terrifying. At first, authoritarian leaders rely on talented generals, skilled advisors, and competent technocrats. But over time, competence becomes dangerous. Why? Because competent people eventually speak uncomfortable truths. And dictators do not fear ignorance. They fear independence. So slowly, the inner circle changes. The strategist is replaced by the loyalist. The realist is replaced by the flatterer. The truth teller is replaced by the silent survivor. Eventually, the regime no longer rewards intelligence. It rewards psychological safety. The leader no longer asks, "Who is most capable?" Instead, he asks, "Who makes me feel least threatened?" That is the beginning of institutional decay. You can see this pattern repeatedly throughout history. When power becomes concentrated in one individual, trust disappears. And once trust disappears, control expands. The ruler begins interfering in everything: military operations, economic decisions, intelligence reports, even personal loyalty networks. Why? Because he no longer believes anyone can be trusted. But here is the paradox. The more control he gains, the less accurate information he receives. Subordinates stop reporting reality. They start reporting survival. And once fear enters the communication system, reality itself becomes distorted. Officials hide failures. Generals exaggerate victories. Advisors tell the leader what he wants to hear. The regime becomes trapped inside its own illusion. This is why many authoritarian governments appear powerful right before collapse. Externally, they project strength. Internally, they are suffocating from fear. And then comes the next psychological stage, the terror of appearing weak. Authoritarian rulers often believe that the moment they show compromise, hesitation, or restraint, they are finished. So every crisis becomes existential. A protest is no longer a protest. It becomes treason. Criticism is no longer disagreement. It becomes betrayal. And because they interpret weakness as death, they escalate force again and again. But excessive force creates another problem. Fear spreads outward first, then inward. Soon, officials begin monitoring each other. Military officers report on fellow officers. Intelligence agencies compete to expose internal enemies. Political loyalty becomes more important than competence. At this stage, the government stops functioning as a system. It becomes a survival arena. People no longer cooperate. They calculate. They no longer seek truth. They seek protection. This is when purges, public humiliations, and sudden dismissals begin increasing rapidly. And here is one of the clearest warning signs in history. When a regime starts repeatedly replacing trusted insiders, the collapse process has usually already begun. Because purges do not eliminate fear. They feed it. Each punishment creates temporary relief for the ruler. Perhaps I removed the threat. But immediately another thought appears. What if more enemies remain? And so the cycle accelerates. More surveillance, more loyalty tests, more paranoia, more purges, until eventually the regime begins attacking shadows created by its own fear. This is why ancient spiritual philosophy becomes surprisingly relevant to modern politics. The Tibetan Book of the Dead contains a profound psychological warning. Fear creates illusion. That may sound mystical, but psychologically it is extraordinarily precise. A fearful mind stops seeing reality objectively. Instead, it projects its inner terror onto the external world. And that is exactly what happens inside collapsing authoritarian systems. The ruler no longer governs reality. He governs his own fear. Enemies appear everywhere. Disloyalty appears everywhere. Threats appear everywhere. Eventually, the regime becomes isolated not from foreign enemies, but from reality itself. And this is why history repeatedly shows the same pattern. First, distrust destroys truth. Then over-control destroys institutions. Then fear destroys judgment. And once those three collapse together, power begins rotting from within, not externally, internally. This is the critical lesson many societies fail to understand. Power is not ultimately sustained by force. It is sustained by trust, stabilized by distributed responsibility, preserved by the ability to face reality honestly. The moment those disappear, collapse has already started, even if the regime still looks strong on television. So when you see repeated purges, extreme loyalty rituals, sudden policy reversals, growing internal accusations, and public punishment of insiders, you are no longer watching stability. You are watching psychological disintegration in real time. And perhaps the most important insight is this: dictatorships do not collapse because they become too weak. They collapse because fear makes them destroy the very systems that once made them strong. That is the hidden mechanism of power. And once you see that pattern, history begins to look very different. If this analysis gave you a deeper perspective on how power really collapses, subscribe, share this video, and join us for the next discussion. When does America decide to intervene? Because the psychology of collapsing regimes is only one half of the story.